In Michigan, scrap metal dealers are suddenly having a hard time selling their goods overseas. Scrap metal is any kind of metal which is no longer wanted by consumers or manufacturers, but can still be sold to recyclers for a new value in being smelted down and reused in new products. In the past, US scrap metal buyers have sold overseas to China in large volume. But in May of this year, the Trump administration levied tariffs against almost all countries with which the US does business, and China levied counter tariffs against the US. These tariffs concerning aluminum and steel, the primary metals with which these metal scrap metal dealers are concerned. So all of these big terms mean that scrap metal buyers in the US are suddenly finding themselves with piles and piles of metal on their hands, which they don't know what to do with. In the past, they would have sold them to China, but this is no longer as much of an option, and they're losing money and possibly going to have to lay off workers or deal with different financial consequences. Their other option is to sell to US recyclers, but right now there aren't that many US recyclers to buy this metal. A research study out of the University of Michigan found a possible solution to this issue. If the US recycling industry simply becomes more efficient, the US could meet its targets that the Trump administration set and intended to push toward by creating these tariffs, just by increasing the amount of recycling that the US does of its scrap metal. Right now, US production of aluminum and steel is mostly composed of recycled steel. Almost 80% or over 80% of steel and almost 70% of aluminum, unless I have those two switched, are already synthesized from scrap metal. This means that in the future, if this is expanded, the US could meet these targets, like I said. So, altogether, a news feature story about this issue would tie together interviews with the Institute of Scrap Metal Recycling and this researcher, uh, Dan Brennan, at the University of Michigan, and interviews with people on the ground, those people being the scrap metal dealers and their employees who may or may not be laid off. The article would have a giant target audience in that almost everyone in the US is impacted by this issue.